The scorching sun beat down on Meadowvale as Margaret Dawson stepped off the stagecoach, her once pristine blue dress now torn at the hem from her harrowing journey across the frontier. The year was 1875, and the Wyoming Territory promised a fresh start for a woman with nothing but determination and the few possessions she carried in her weathered carpetbag. Margaret Maggie to the few who'd earned the right brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face as she surveyed the dusty Main Street. Meadowvale wasn't much to look at. A general store, saloon, small hotel, and scattered buildings that comprised the settlement. But it represented something precious to her freedom from the memories that haunted her back in St. Louis. "Watch your step, miss," the stagecoach driver called as he tossed down her trunk. It landed with a thud, sending up a small cloud of dust that settled on her already travel-worn attire. "Thank you," she replied, reaching for her belongings. At 23, Maggie had learned to fend for herself, especially after losing her parents to influenza 2 years prior. The teaching position awaiting her at Meadowvale's newly established schoolhouse was her chance to build a new life. As she struggled with her trunk, she caught sight of her reflection in the general store window. Her dress, once her best, was not only torn at the hem but smudged with the dirt of travel. Her hair, which she'd carefully pinned that morning, now fell in loose tendrils around her face. She looked nothing like the proper schoolteacher she'd hoped to present. The sound of laughter drew her attention to the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, where 3 well-dressed women observed her with obvious amusement. "My goodness," one said loudly enough for Maggie to hear. "Is that what passes for fashion back east these days? A torn dress and hair like a haystack," the second woman tittered behind her gloved hand. "Perhaps she's auditioning for a position inside the saloon instead of the schoolhouse." The third merely smirked, her eyes traveling from Maggie's dusty boots to her disheveled hair. Heat rushed to Maggie's cheeks. She'd known Meadowvale would be different from St. Louis, but she hadn't expected such a cold welcome. Drawing herself up to her full height, which was still rather modest, she attempted to maintain her dignity despite their cutting remarks. "Ladies," a deep voice drawled from behind her, "if you've nothing better to do than mock a newcomer, perhaps you should find yourselves some worthwhile occupation." Maggie turned to find herself looking up quite a ways up at a man whose presence seemed to command the very air around him. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the open sky, he cut an imposing figure. His dark hat shadowed eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, and a day's worth of stubble lined his strong jaw. "We were merely making an observation, Mr. York," the first woman said, her tone softening considerably. "Then observe this," he replied, tipping his hat to Maggie. "She's already the finest woman here, torn dress and all. At least she's not hiding an ugly heart behind fancy clothes." The women's smiles faltered and they retreated into the saloon, whispers following in their wake. Maggie stood speechless, equal parts grateful for the intervention and mortified by the entire encounter. "Zachary York," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "Most folks call me Zach." "Margaret Dawson," she replied, placing her hand in his. "I'm the new schoolteacher." A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Figured as much. Town's been talking about your arrival for weeks." He glanced at her trunk and carpetbag. "Let me help you with those, Mrs. Foster's boarding house is just down the street." Before she could protest, he'd hoisted her trunk onto one shoulder as if it weighed nothing at all. "Welcome to Meadowvale, Miss Dawson. It's not always as unwelcoming as those 3 make it seem." As they walked side by side down the dusty street, Maggie sneaked glances at her unexpected champion. There was something about Zachary York that intrigued her beyond his handsome features and timely rescue. "Are you the town sheriff, Mr. York?" she asked, noting the quiet authority with which he'd addressed the women. A low chuckle escaped him. "No, madam, just a rancher. My place is about 5 miles outside town, the Double Z." He adjusted her trunk on his shoulder. "Though around here, folks tend to listen when I talk." "Comes from being one of the first to settle this valley, I suppose. And one of the wealthiest from what I hear," came a voice from the boardwalk. An older gentleman with a silver mustache stepped forward, hand extended. "Robert Thompson, mayor of Meadowvale, you must be our new schoolteacher." "Margaret Dawson, sir, it's a pleasure to meet you." "The pleasure is ours, Miss Dawson. We've been in sore need of education in these parts." The mayor's eyes flicked to her torn dress, but to his credit, he made no comment. I see you've met Zach. Good man to know, owns half the cattle in the county and has the respect of every decent person for 50 miles. Zach shifted uncomfortably at the praise. Mayor exaggerates, just trying to make an honest living, same as anyone. Modesty doesn't become you, York, the mayor laughed, then turned back to Maggie. School term starts in 2 weeks. That should give you time to settle in and prepare. The schoolhouse is at the edge of town. Zach here donated the lumber to build it. Maggie looked at the tall cowboy with newfound appreciation. That was very generous of you, Mr. York. Education matters, he said simply, as if that explained everything. After parting from the mayor, they continued toward the boarding house. Maggie was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople as they passed. A stranger in a small town was always a subject of interest, but a woman walking alongside Zachary York seemed to provoke particular attention. I'm afraid I've made you the center of gossip, Mr. York, she said quietly. Wouldn't be the first time, he replied with a half smile. Besides, they were going to talk anyway. New schoolteachers, big news around here, Mrs. Foster's boarding house turned out to be a tidy 2-story building with white lace curtains in the windows and pots of geraniums on the porch. As they approached, the front door swung open to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. There she is. The woman exclaimed, I've been watching for the stagecoach. You must be Miss Dawson. Her gaze shifted to Zach. And Mr. York, how nice to see you, helping our newcomer already, I see. Just being neighborly, Mrs. Foster. He set the trunk down on the porch. Miss Dawson had a rough welcome from the Baxter sisters and their friend, thought she could use a friendly face. Mrs. Foster's expression soured. Those three, don't you pay them any mind, dear. They think because their husbands have money, they're entitled to look down on everyone else. She ushered Maggie inside. Come along, I've got your room all ready and there's fresh lemonade in the kitchen. Maggie turned to Zach, who remained on the porch. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. York. I'm in your debt. No debt, Miss Dawson, just welcome to Meadowvale. He tipped his hat and stepped back. If you need anything at all, folks around here know how to find me. As he strode away, Maggie couldn't help but watch his retreating figure. There was something magnetic about Zachary York, something that went beyond his good looks or the timely rescue he'd provided. She had a feeling their paths would cross again soon. Mrs. Foster led her to a small but comfortable room on the 2nd floor with a view of the mountains in the distance. Bathrooms at the end of the hall. We've got indoor plumbing, which is more than most can say in these parts. Dinner's at 6 sharp. It's lovely, Mrs. Foster, thank you. Left alone, Maggie sank onto the bed, the events of the day catching up with her. She ran her fingers along the torn hem of her dress, remembering Zach's words. She's already the finest woman here. No one had ever defended her like that before. She opened her trunk and removed a small framed photograph her parents on their wedding day. I made it, Mama, she whispered. It's going to be different here. I can feel it. The next morning, Maggie rose early, eager to explore her new home. She dressed in one of her simple calico dresses intact this time and twisted her hair into a neat bun. Mrs. Foster provided a hearty breakfast and directions to the schoolhouse. It's a fine building, the landlady assured her. 24 children ages 6 to 16. They're good children mostly, though a few of the boys might test your patience. The schoolhouse sat on a gentle rise at the edge of town, a single-room building with a small bell tower. Inside, rows of desks faced a teacher's desk and blackboard. Bookshelves lined one wall, though they were sparsely filled. What do you think? Came a voice from the doorway. Maggie turned to find Zach leaning against the frame, hat in hand. Today, in the clear morning light, she could see his features more distinctly, the small scar that bisected one eyebrow, the laugh lines around his eyes, the strong column of his throat above his bandana. It's wonderful, she said, meaning it. Though the library could use some expansion. Thought you might say that. He stepped inside, revealing a crate in his hands. These belong to my mother. She was a teacher back in Virginia before she married my father. Thought you might put them to good use. Maggie opened the crate to find nearly 24 books, classics, history volumes, even a collection of Shakespeare. Mr. York, I couldn't possibly. They've been gathering dust in my attic for years, he said. Mom would have wanted them used. The gift touched her deeply. Thank you. The children will benefit greatly from these. Speaking of children, he said, setting his hat back on his head, my foreman's son is 12 and smart as a whip, but he's fallen behind with his reading. His mother died last year and he's had a hard time of it. Would you consider giving him some extra help once you're settled? Of course, she replied without hesitation. What's his name? Thomas Miller. His father, John, is my right-hand man at the ranch. They spent the next hour organizing the books and discussing the needs of the school. Zach seemed genuinely interested in education, knowledgeable about literature and history in a way that surprised her. You're well-read for a rancher, she observed. Long winters and a mother who wouldn't let me grow up ignorant, he replied with a smile. Besides, a man should know more than just cattle and horses. Their conversation flowed easily, and Maggie found herself laughing at his dry humor and insightful observations. It was only when the town clock struck 11 that Zach reluctantly took his leave. I've got business with the bank, he explained. But I'll be in town for the social on Saturday night. It's at the town hall, nothing fancy, just music and dancing, a way for folks to gather. Would be a good chance for you to meet everyone properly. That sounds wonderful, Maggie said, surprised by how much she looked forward to seeing him again. As promised, Saturday evening brought the town social. Maggie wore her best dress, a modest but becoming blue gown that matched her eyes. Mrs. Foster had helped her mend her torn traveling dress, but it would be some time before it was presentable again. The town hall was decorated with paper lanterns and wildflowers. A small band played lively tunes while couples twirled across the wooden floor. Maggie stood near the refreshment table, already having been introduced to so many people that the names blurred together. Miss Dawson, Mayor Thompson approached with his wife. You remember Mrs. Thompson, and have you met the Reverend Caldwell yet? More introductions followed, and Maggie did her best to appear poised and professional. These people were entrusting their children to her care, after all. But all the while, her eyes scanned the room for a tall figure in a cowboy hat. When Zach finally arrived, the reaction was immediate. People gravitated toward him, men clapping him on the back, women smiling and adjusting their hair. He moved through the crowd with easy confidence, stopping to speak with everyone, but his eyes found Maggie across the room and he made his way toward her. Miss Dawson, he said, bowing slightly. You look lovely this evening. Thank you, Mr. York, you clean up rather well yourself. Indeed, he'd traded his work clothes for a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, though he still wore his cowboy boots. Would you care to dance? He asked, extending his hand. The band had just begun a waltz, and Maggie placed her hand in his, acutely aware of the eyes watching them. As they moved onto the dance floor, she felt a flutter of nervousness. I should warn you, I'm not the most accomplished dancer, she admitted. That makes two of us, he replied with a grin. But I promise not to step on your toes if you promise not to laugh when I count under my breath. True to his word, she caught him murmuring 1, 2, 3 as they began to move, but he led with surprising grace for a man more at home in the saddle than a dance hall. His hand was warm and steady at her waist, and she could detect the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. Everyone's watching us, she murmured. Let them, he replied. They're just curious about the woman brave enough to take on their children. He guided her through a turn, and maybe wondering why the confirmed bachelor is dancing with the new schoolteacher. Is that what you are? A confirmed bachelor. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, perhaps. That's what they call a man my age who's never married. I'm 32, Miss Dawson. Around here, most men are married with half a dozen children by 30. And why aren't you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. I'm sorry, that's terribly forward of me. No, it's a fair question. The music swelled around them as he considered his answer. I was engaged once, about 10 years ago. Elizabeth was her name. She came out west with her family, but the life was harder than she expected. When her father decided to return east, she went with him. His voice remained steady, but Maggie sensed the old wound beneath his words. I had a choice, the ranch or her. I chose the ranch. Do you regret it? Sometimes, but not as often as I used to. His eyes held hers. What about you? No husband waiting back in St. Louis, Maggie shook her head. No, there was someone once, a fellow teacher, but he wanted a wife who would give up her career when they married. I wasn't willing to do that. His loss, Zach said simply. The dance ended and he led her back toward the refreshment table. "Would you like some punch?" Before she could answer, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. A man burst hat in hand, face flushed with exertion. "Mr. York," he called. "Fire at your south pasture. Lightning strike from that storm brewing. The men are trying to contain it, but it's spreading fast." Zach's expression hardened instantly. "Round up any men willing to help, John. I'll get my horse." He turned to Maggie, regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, go," she said, understanding immediately. "Be careful." He nodded once, then was gone, moving swiftly through the crowd. Several other men followed, the festive atmosphere evaporating as the seriousness of the situation became clear. "Will it be bad?" Maggie asked Mayor Thompson, who stood nearby. "Could be," the mayor replied grimly. "It's been dry for weeks. If that fire reaches the main grazing land, Zach could lose a good portion of his herd, and if it spreads beyond his property." He didn't need to finish the thought. The social continued, but subdued, with many of the men gone to fight the fire. Maggie found it hard to concentrate on polite conversation, her thoughts with Zach and the men facing the dangerous blaze. She left earlier than she'd planned, walking back to the boarding house with Mrs. Foster. The night sky to the south glowed an ominous orange, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. "He'll be all right," Mrs. Foster said, patting Maggie's arm. "Zach York survived worse than a pasture fire." But sleep eluded Maggie that night, her mind filled with images of Zach facing the flames, of the ranch he loved threatened with destruction. It surprised her how quickly he'd come to matter to her, this man she barely knew but somehow felt connected to. Morning brought news. The fire had been contained after hours of backbreaking work. 2 men had suffered minor burns, but no lives were lost. Zach's cattle had been driven to safety, though he'd lost a substantial amount of grazing land and a small outbuilding. Relieved but still concerned, Maggie went about her preparations for the school term. Over the next few days, she organized her classroom, developed lesson plans, and met with parents. She saw nothing of Zach, though she heard he was working tirelessly to secure feed for his cattle now that a portion of his land was unusable. A week after the fire, she was working late at the schoolhouse when a knock at the door startled her. She looked up to find Zach standing there, looking exhausted but whole. His face was smudged with soot and a bandage wrapped his left forearm. "Mr. York," she said, rising from her desk. "I'm so glad you're all right. I heard about the fire. Could have been worse," he said, stepping inside. Despite his obvious fatigue, he surveyed her classroom with interest. "The place looks good. You've been busy." "As have you, from what I hear." She gestured to his bandaged arm. "Are you hurt badly?" He glanced down as if surprised to see the bandage. "This, just a burn. Doc patched me up." He moved closer, his gaze taking in the colorful maps she'd hung on the walls, the carefully arranged desks. "I wanted to apologize for disappearing at the social. Not the best way to end a dance." "There's nothing to apologize for," she assured him. "Your ranch was in danger. Still." He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I wondered if I might make it up to you. Sunday after church if you attend, that is, I thought you might like to see some of the country around here. I could take you on a drive, show you the sights." His invitation caught her by surprise, though not an unwelcome one. "I'd like that very much, Mr. York." "Zach," he said. "If we're going to be spending time together, I'd prefer you called me Zach." "Zach," she repeated, liking the way it felt. "Then you must call me Maggie." A smile transformed his tired face. "Maggie it is." He put his hat back on. "I'll pick you up after the service. Where something comfortable, some of the best views require a bit of walking." Sunday dawned clear and bright. Maggie attended the small church with Mrs. Foster, meeting more townspeople and trying not to be too obvious about watching for Zach. He arrived just as the service was beginning, slipping into a pew near the back. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod before turning his attention to Reverend Caldwell. After the service, he waited for her outside, standing beside a handsome buggy drawn by 2 matching bay horses. "Your carriage, madam," he said with a playful bow as he helped her up. The day that followed was one Maggie would remember for years to come. Zach drove them through rolling countryside, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. He knew every hill and valley, every stream and stand of trees, speaking of the land with the intimate knowledge of a man who had walked every inch of it. They stopped for a picnic lunch beside a clear stream, spreading a blanket on the grass. Zach had brought a basket filled with cold chicken, fresh bread, and apple pie made by his cook. "This is heaven," Maggie sighed, leaning back on her elbows after they'd eaten. "I never imagined Wyoming would be so beautiful." "Most people don't," Zach said, stretching his long legs out before him. "They think it's all dust and cattle, but there's magic here if you know where to look." He told her about his ranch, the Double Z, named for his father's initials. Zachary York SR had come west after the Civil War, building a small cattle operation into one of the largest in the territory before his death 5 years earlier. "It was just me and Pa for a long time after Mom died," he explained. "He taught me everything: how to track, how to predict weather from the way birds fly, how to judge a man's character. He was a good man, tough but fair." "He sounds like someone I would have admired," Maggie said. "He would have liked you," Zach replied with certainty. "He always said education was what would tame the West, not guns." As the afternoon waned, Zach drove them to a high ridge overlooking a vast expanse of land. In the distance, buildings were visible: the Double Z ranch house and outbuildings. "That's home," he said simply, a note of pride in his voice. "Not as fancy as some, but solid. The main house has 8 rooms, including a library that would interest you. The bunkhouse houses 20 men in the busy season. And there," he pointed to a distant field where cattle grazed, "that's where we're rebuilding after the fire." Maggie studied the ranch, trying to see it through his eyes. "It's impressive, Zach. You've built something remarkable. Built on what my father started," he corrected. "But thank you." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like to show it to you properly sometime, maybe next Sunday," and so began a pattern. Each Sunday after church, Zach would arrive with his buggy to take Maggie on an excursion. Sometimes they explored the countryside. Other times they visited his ranch, where she admired his library and met the ranch hands who clearly respected their boss. Occasionally, they simply drove into town for ice cream at the new confectionery. Meanwhile, the school term began, and Maggie found herself fully engaged with her 24 pupils. They were a diverse group: children of ranchers, shopkeepers, and laborers. Some came to school clean and well-fed, others arrived hungry and in patched clothing. But all were eager to learn, especially after Maggie introduced them to the wonders contained in the books Zach had given her. Thomas Miller, the foreman's son, proved to be exactly as Zach had described him: bright but struggling. Maggie began keeping him after school 3 days a week for extra reading lessons, and slowly his confidence improved along with his skills. "You're making a difference with that boy," Zach told her one Sunday as they sat on the porch of his ranch house. "John says Thomas hasn't stopped talking about school since you came. He's a wonderful child," Maggie replied. "All he needed was some individual attention." Zach studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You're good with children, patient, understanding. You'd make a fine mother someday." The observation caught her off guard. "Perhaps, if I find the right partner." She changed the subject quickly. "How are the repairs coming since the fire?" He allowed the diversion, but the moment stayed with her: the way he'd looked at her, the implications of his words. Over the past month, their Sunday outings had become the highlight of her week, and she found herself thinking of Zach at odd moments during her days. His quiet strength, his unexpected humor, the gentle way he treated everyone from the town drunk to the banker's wife, all had worked their way into her heart, but she was cautious. Her position as schoolteacher demanded propriety, and Meadowvale, like any small town, thrived on gossip. Already there were whispers about the attention Zachary York paid to the new schoolteacher. One afternoon, as Maggie dismissed her class, she was surprised to find one of the women from her first day in town waiting outside: Eliza Baxter, the mayor's sister-in-law and the leader of the trio who had mocked her torn dress. "Miss Dawson," the woman said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I wonder if I might have a word." "Of course, Mrs. Baxter. Please come in." Maggie maintained her professional demeanor despite the unease she felt. Eliza Baxter glanced around the schoolroom with a critical eye. "You've done well with the place. Though I must say, some of the books you're teaching from seem rather advanced for frontier children. I believe in challenging my students, Mrs. Baxter. They're capable of more than many give them credit for." The woman trailed her gloved fingers along a desk. I'll come straight to the point, Miss Dawson. There has been talk about your relationship with Zachary York. Maggie stiffened. Mr. York and I are friends. He's been kind enough to show me the area on Sundays after church. Yes, everyone has noticed your Sunday drives. Eliza's tone was honey over steel. Such attentions from Meadowvale's most eligible bachelor have not gone unremarked. I feel it my duty to warn you Zach has a certain reputation. Reputation? Maggie repeated, confused, as something of a heartbreaker, my dear. Every few years, some new woman catches his eye. He courts her with Sunday drives and flowers, leads her to believe there might be a future, then retreats back to his precious ranch. The town has seen it before. Anger flared in Maggie's chest, but she kept her voice level. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Baxter, but I believe you misunderstand the situation. Do I? Eliza raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. Tell me, has he spoken of marriage? Has he introduced you to his business associates as anything other than the schoolteacher? Has he invited you to accompany him to Cheyenne for the Cattlemen's Association dinner next month? Each question struck Maggie like a small blow. No, Zach hadn't done any of those things. Their relationship, whatever it was, remained undefined. The school board values propriety, Miss Dawson, Eliza continued. A teacher who becomes the subject of gossip may find her position uncomfortable. I would hate to see that happen to you. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Maggie straightened her spine. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Baxter. If there's nothing else, I have papers to grade. After Eliza left, Maggie sat at her desk, troubled. Was there truth to the woman's warnings? Had she misread Zach's intentions? The question plagued her throughout the week, casting a shadow over her anticipation of their next Sunday drive. When Zach arrived as usual after church, she found herself studying him with new eyes, looking for signs that Eliza might be right. But his smile was as warm as ever, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. I thought we might visit the hot springs today, he said as he helped her into the buggy. It's a bit of a drive, but worth it, she agreed, but as they traveled, Maggie was unusually quiet, turning Eliza's words over in her mind. Something bothering you? Zach asked eventually, his perception as sharp as ever. She hesitated, then decided directness was best. Eliza Baxter paid me a visit at the school this week. His expression darkened slightly. Did she? And what did Mrs. Baxter have to say? She suggested that our friendship might damage my reputation, and she implied that you have a history of leading women on. Zach's hands tightened on the reins, and for a moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but tense. Eliza Baxter has been trying to match me with her niece for 3 years. She doesn't appreciate competition. So it's not true about the other women. He sighed, pulling the buggy to a stop beneath a large oak tree. Turning to face her, his expression was serious. After Elizabeth left, there were a couple of women I courted. One was a widow from Denver who stayed in Meadowvale for 6 months while settling her late husband's business. We spent time together, but she returned to Denver as planned. The other was the daughter of a cattle buyer. We saw each other whenever she visited with her father, but ultimately she married a banker in Laramie. He ran a hand through his hair. Neither relationship was as serious as town gossip made it out to be, and I never made promises I didn't intend to keep. Maggie studied his face, finding nothing but honesty there. I believe you. Good. He took her hand, his touch sending warmth through her. Because what's between us, Maggie, it's not like those other times. It's different. You're different. Different how? She asked softly, his thumb traced circles on her palm. I think about you when we're apart. I find myself riding past the schoolhouse just to catch a glimpse of you teaching. I've never felt this way before, not even with Elizabeth. The admission sent her heart racing. Zach, let me finish, he said. I know it's only been a couple of months. I know we're still learning about each other, but I want you to know my intentions are honorable. I'm not playing games. And as for that cattlemen's dinner Eliza mentioned, I was going to ask you today if you'd accompany me. Surprise and pleasure washed over her. You knew what she said. John Miller's wife cleans for the Baxters. Not much happens in this town that I don't eventually hear about. A smile tugged at his lips. So will you come with me to Cheyenne? It's a 3-day trip, but Mrs. Foster could chaperone, of course. I'd be honored, she replied, happiness bubbling up inside her. Good. He leaned closer, his eyes dropping to her lips. There's something else I've been wanting to do, if you'll permit it. Her breath caught. Yes, she whispered. His kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, it deepened, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. In that moment, the rest of the world fell away. Eliza Baxter's warnings, the town's gossip, even the hot springs they'd planned to visit. There was only Zach, the warmth of his touch, and the knowledge that something precious was beginning between them. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you arrived in town with your torn dress and your head held high," she laughed softly. Even then. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, standing there with dirt on your face and determination in your eyes." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about their hopes and fears, their pasts and possible future. Zach spoke of his dreams for the ranch, of the improvements he wanted to make, the legacy he hoped to build. Maggie shared her passion for education, her belief that knowledge was the greatest gift one could give a child. As the sun began to set, Zach reluctantly turned the buggy toward town. "I should get you back before Mrs. Foster sends out a search party." "She likes you, you know," Maggie said, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "Says you're a proper gentleman, not like some of those cowboys. High praise indeed," he grinned. "I'll have to send her some of those raspberry preserves she likes from the ranch kitchen." When they reached the boarding house, he helped her down from the buggy, holding her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Sunday seems a long way off," he said. "It does," she agreed. "But I believe there's a school board meeting on Wednesday. Perhaps you could escort me," his face brightened. "I'd be delighted, Miss Dawson." "Until Wednesday then, Mr. York." She smiled and turned to go inside, feeling his eyes on her until the door closed behind her. The following weeks brought a deepening of their relationship. Zach began to court Maggie in earnest, with flowers delivered to the schoolhouse and invitations to dinner at the hotel's restaurant. They attended social events together, no longer hiding their affection. And if there were whispers, they paid them little mind. The trip to Cheyenne for the Cattlemen's Association dinner proved to be a turning point. Despite Mrs. Foster's presence as chaperone, they found moments of privacy: a walk through the hotel garden, a quiet conversation on the train. Zach introduced Maggie to his business associates and fellow ranchers not as the schoolteacher, but as the woman who's captured my heart. On their last evening in Cheyenne, after the dinner had concluded, Zach asked Maggie to accompany him to the hotel's terrace. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. "I've been thinking," he said, taking her hands in his, "about us, about the future." Maggie's heart quickened. "Have you? The ranch house feels empty when I return to it now. I find myself thinking how it would be with your books on the shelves, your voice filling the rooms." He took a deep breath. "What I'm trying to say, Maggie, is that I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears pricked her eyes. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a ring of sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "It was my mother's," he explained. "Margaret Dawson, will you marry me?" "Yes," she whispered, joy overwhelming her. "Yes, Zach, I will." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger as if it had been made for her. When he kissed her, it was a promise of love, of partnership, of a future brighter than either had imagined alone. They returned to Meadowvale as an engaged couple, their happiness apparent to all who saw them. Even Eliza Baxter could not darken their joy, though she sniffed disapprovingly when the announcement was made at church the following Sunday. "Mid-December," Maggie told Mrs. Foster as they planned the wedding. "After the school term ends and before the worst of winter." "A Christmas bride," the older woman sighed happily. "How romantic." The months leading up to the wedding passed in a whirl of activity. Maggie continued teaching, now with the knowledge that this would be her last term at Meadowvale's schoolhouse. She and Zach had discussed her future role extensively. "I don't expect you to give up teaching entirely," he told her. "The ranch hand's children have no school nearby. We could convert one of the outbuildings, hire another teacher to help when needed." His understanding of her passion touched her deeply. "You wouldn't mind having a school on the ranch?" "Mind, I think it's brilliant. Education matters, remember?" He kissed her forehead. "Besides, you'll make a wonderful rancher's wife, but I'd never ask you to be less than who you are." As their wedding day approached, preparations intensified. The entire town seemed invested in their union. Women gathered to help Maggie sew her wedding dress, men offered to decorate the church. Even Thomas Miller, who had blossomed under Maggie's tutelage, proudly announced that his father had asked him to be part of the ceremony. "Pa says I'm to hold the rings," the boy told her during one of their reading sessions. Mr. York asked him to be his best man, and Pa said yes. "That's wonderful, Thomas. I can't think of anyone better to trust with such an important job." 2 weeks before the wedding, a letter arrived for Maggie from her cousin in St. Louis, bearing disturbing news. Her former suitor, James Porter, had learned of her engagement and was telling anyone who would listen that she had left St. Louis under a cloud of scandal. "He claims you were dismissed from your teaching position for improper conduct," her cousin wrote. "Of course, no one who knows you believes it, but he's quite convincing to strangers. I thought you should know in case he tries to cause trouble." Maggie sat with the letter clutched in her hand, anger and fear warring within her. James had been bitter when she refused his proposal, but she never imagined he would stoop to such slander. She debated whether to tell Zach, not wanting to burden him with this ugliness so close to their wedding. But their relationship had been built on honesty from the beginning, and she wouldn't start hiding things now. When she showed him the letter that evening, his reaction surprised her. Rather than anger or doubt, he displayed a calm certainty that soothed her fears. "James Porter sounds like a small man trying to make himself feel important," he said, folding the letter and setting it aside. "His lies can't touch us here, Maggie. But what if he doesn't stop at lies?" she worried. "What if he comes here?" Zach's expression hardened slightly. "Then he'll find that Wyoming men protect their own. But I doubt he has the courage to face you or me directly." His confidence reassured her, and as the days passed with no further word from St. Louis, the incident began to fade from her mind. There were happier matters to focus on: final fittings for her wedding dress, decisions about flowers and music, and quiet evenings with Zach, planning their future together. The weekend before the wedding, the town held a celebration in their honor at the town hall. Nearly everyone in Meadowvale attended, bringing gifts and well wishes. Maggie, radiant in a new blue dress that matched her engagement ring, stood beside Zach as they greeted their neighbors and friends. "You look happy," Mrs. Foster observed, pressing a gift into Maggie's hands. "It does my heart good to see it." "I am happy," Maggie replied, glancing at Zach, who was deep in conversation with the blacksmith. "Happier than I ever thought possible." As the evening progressed, Mayor Thompson called for attention. Friends, neighbors, were gathered to celebrate the upcoming union of two people who have become dear to all of us. Zach York has been the backbone of this community since before most of us arrived, and Miss Dawson, soon to be Mrs. York, has brought education and grace to our little town. He raised his glass. To the bride and groom, the crowd echoed the toast, glasses raised high. Zach slipped his arm around Maggie's waist, drawing her close. The moment was perfect until the doors of the town hall burst open, admitting a gust of cold air and a man Maggie had hoped never to see again. James Porter stood in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow, his face flushed with either cold or anger. His gaze found Maggie immediately. "There she is," he said loudly. "The woman who broke our engagement to run off to Wyoming. Did she tell you that, Mr. York? Did she mention she was promised to another man when she came here?" A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Maggie felt Zach's arm tighten around her waist, but before either of them could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "That's a lie." All eyes turned to find Robert Thompson, the mayor, stepping forward. "I received a letter just yesterday from the school board in St. Louis confirming Miss Dawson's excellent record and recommendation. There was no mention of any engagement." "Of course not," James sputtered. "She wouldn't want it known, and I've got a telegram right here," Sheriff Davis said, pulling a paper from his pocket, "from a Judge Porter in St. Louis. Your father, I believe, says you've been making false claims about Miss Dawson, and he apologizes for his son's behavior." James paled visibly. "My father had no right, he had every right," the sheriff interrupted. "Just as I have every right to suggest you leave Meadowvale immediately. The next train east departs in an hour. I suggest you be on it." For a moment, it seemed James might argue, but faced with the united front of the townspeople, he deflated. With a last venomous glance at Maggie, he turned and stalked out, the doors swinging shut behind him. In the silence that followed, Maggie looked up at Zach, uncertain of his reaction, but the love and trust in his eyes never wavered. "Well," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "I believe we were in the middle of a celebration. Music, please." As the band struck up a lively tune, the tension dissolved. Zach led Maggie onto the dance floor, holding her close as they moved to the music. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I am now," she replied. "But how did the mayor know to contact the school board? And how did the sheriff get a telegram from James's father?" A small smile played at Zach's lips. "Let's just say I took precautions after your cousin's letter arrived. This is my town, Maggie. No one comes here to hurt what's mine." The possessive note in his voice sent a pleasant shiver through her. "Yours am I, mine to love, to protect, to cherish." His eyes held hers. "Just as I am yours from this day forward." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of dancing and laughter, the incident with James soon forgotten in the joy of celebration. And when Zach escorted Maggie back to Mrs. Foster's boarding house at the end of the night, their goodbye kiss held a promise of the future they would soon begin together. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, a perfect December morning with frost glittering on every surface. Maggie stood in her room at the boarding house, surrounded by the women who had become her friends over the past months, as they helped her into her wedding dress. The gown was simple but elegant ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, a modest train trailing behind. Her veil, borrowed from Mrs. Foster, was secured with a comb that had belonged to Zach's mother. "Something borrowed, something blue," Mrs. Foster said, tucking a blue ribbon into Maggie's bouquet of winter roses. "And this," she pressed a silver coin into Maggie's hand, "for prosperity." A knock at the door revealed Thomas Miller, looking uncomfortable but proud in his Sunday best. "Miss Dawson, Pa sent me to tell you the church is ready and Mr. York is waiting." "Thank you, Thomas," Maggie replied, feeling a flutter of anticipation. "Tell them I'll be right there." The walk to the church was short but memorable, the townspeople lining the street to watch Maggie pass. Some threw rice, others called out good wishes. By the time she reached the church steps, her cheeks were flushed with cold and happiness. Inside, the small building was transformed, evergreen boughs and white ribbons decorating the pews, candles casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. And at the altar, waiting beside Reverend Caldwell and John Miller, stood Zach. He turned as the music began, and the look on his face as he saw Maggie for the first time in her wedding dress was one she would treasure forever, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and unmistakable love. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises to love and support each other through whatever life might bring. When Thomas stepped forward with the rings, his chest puffed with importance, there were smiles throughout the congregation. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Caldwell declared. "Zachary, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was sweet and reverent, a beginning rather than an end. When they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Zachary York, the church erupted in cheers. The reception was held at the town hall, transformed once again, this time with white flowers and ribbons. A feast prepared by the women of Meadowvale covered long tables, and the band played cheerful tunes as people ate, drank, and celebrated. "Are you happy, Mrs. York?" Zach asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Completely, Mr. York," she replied, the new name still wonderful and strange on her tongue. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." He twirled her gently. "And to think, it all began with a torn dress and some unkind laughter. And a cowboy who saw beyond it," she added softly. As the celebration continued around them, Maggie found herself thinking of that first day in Meadowvale, how lost and alone she had felt, how uncertain of her place in this new world. Now, just months later, she was surrounded by friends, married to a man who treasured her, embarking on a life filled with purpose and love. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave for their honeymoon, a 2-week stay in Denver, Maggie changed from her wedding gown into a traveling suit of deep blue. Zach's wedding gift to her, a pearl pendant, gleamed at her throat. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm as they faced the crowd gathered outside the town hall. "Ready," she confirmed, and together they ran through a shower of rice to the waiting carriage that would take them to the train station. As they pulled away, Maggie looked back at the town that had become her home, at the people waving farewell. Eliza Baxter stood among them, her expression unreadable, but even her presence couldn't diminish Maggie's joy. "She never did apologize for laughing at my torn dress that first day," Maggie mused. Zach's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Maybe not, but I'll never regret it happening. It gave me the chance to tell the truth that you were the finest woman there, torn dress and all." "And now," she teased. He kissed her then, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. "Now you're the finest woman anywhere, Mrs. York, and I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming to call you mine." The carriage carried them through the winter night, away from Meadowvale and toward their honeymoon. But both knew that the true journey their life together was just beginning, a journey that had started with a torn dress, unkind laughter, and a cowboy brave enough to stand up for a woman he didn't yet know but would come to love with all his heart. 5 years later, Maggie stood on the porch of the Double Z ranch house, watching as Zach taught their 4-year-old son, William, to sit a pony. The boy's laughter rang out across the yard, his small hands clutching the saddle horn while his father led the gentle animal in a circle. "Not too fast," she called, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. At 7 months pregnant, she found herself more cautious than she had been with William. "We're being careful, aren't we, Will?" Zach called back, winking at his son, who nodded enthusiastically. "Careful, Mama," William echoed, his face a miniature version of his father's, the same storm gray eyes, the same determined chin. The ranch had prospered in the years since their marriage. The fire damage had long since been repaired, and Zach had expanded their holdings, making the Double Z one of the most successful operations in the territory. But the changes to the land were nothing compared to the changes in their lives. As promised, Zach had converted one of the outbuildings into a schoolhouse, where Maggie taught the children of their ranch hands and neighboring properties 3 days a week. The rest of her time was divided between running the household, keeping the ranch's books, and raising their sons soon-to-be sons, if the baby followed the midwife's predictions. Inside the house, a knock at the back door signaled the arrival of Mary Miller, John's wife, who came to help with household chores now that Maggie's pregnancy made some tasks difficult. "Morning, Mrs. York," Mary called, entering with a basket of fresh eggs. "Thomas sent these over. Said the new hens are laying well." "That's wonderful, thank him for me," Maggie smiled, thinking of the gangly youth who now worked alongside his father on the ranch. At 17, Thomas was still an avid reader, often borrowing books from Zach's library. "Will he be coming to dinner on Sunday?" "Wouldn't miss it," Mary assured her. "Says Mrs. Foster makes the best apple dumplings in the territory." The mention of Mrs. Foster brought a warm smile to Maggie's face. The former landlady had become a fixture at the Double Z, moving in after her husband passed away 2 years earlier. She occupied a comfortable suite of rooms in the east wing of the ranch house, spoiling William shamelessly and providing Maggie with companionship and help that was invaluable. As Mary busied herself in the kitchen, Maggie returned her attention to the scene outside. Zach had lifted William from the pony and was now showing him how to check its hooves, a first lesson in horse care. The sight filled her with contentment. Their life wasn't perfect. Running a ranch brought challenges, from harsh weather to market fluctuations, but it was rich and full in ways she had never imagined. That day, she stepped off the stagecoach with her torn dress and uncertain future. Later that evening, after William had been tucked into bed with a story and Mrs. Foster had retired to her rooms, Maggie and Zach sat together on the porch swing, watching as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I had a letter from Mayor Thompson today," Zach said, his arm around her shoulders. "Eliza Baxter is moving to Denver. Her husband's health isn't good and they want to be closer to specialists." "I'm sorry about Mr. Baxter," Maggie replied sincerely, "but I can't say I'll miss Eliza. Even after all these years, she still looks at me as if I stole something that belonged to her." Zach chuckled. "You did, in a way. She had her heart set on me marrying her niece. Poor girl, she's much better off with that banker from Laramie." Maggie leaned against his shoulder. "Can you believe it's been 5 years since we married? Best 5 years of my life." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. Though I have to say, watching you with William, seeing you carry our second child, it makes me fall in love with you all over again. The baby kicked then, as if responding to his father's voice. Maggie placed Zach's hand on her belly, watching his face light up as he felt the movement. Strong like his brother, he murmured. Or her mother, she countered with a smile. Definitely. He kissed her temple. Remember what I told you that first day? You were the finest woman in Meadowvale. And now, his answer was the same as it had been on their wedding night and every anniversary since. Now you're the finest woman anywhere, Mrs. York, and I'm still the luckiest man in Wyoming to call you mine. As twilight deepened into night, they sat together, talking of the day's events, planning for the future, savoring the present. And Maggie thought, not for the first time, how fortunate she was that her dress had torn that fateful day, that those women had laughed, and that a cowboy with kind eyes and a strong heart had stood up for a stranger. For it had led her here to this life, this love to Zachary York and the home they had built together, a home that would stand for generations to come, built on a foundation of respect, partnership, and a love that had begun with a torn dress and a defense that changed everything.